Hello everyone, this is Connor Smith, President of Mountain View Model United Nations. I'm here to talk about what parliamentary procedure basically is and how that applies to Model United Nations as a whole. Many of you will already know essentially what parliamentary procedure itself is from other clubs. And so it's used in other JTED or in perhaps out-of-state, other kind of like business-oriented clubs such as FBLA, FFA, HOSA, and etc. Basically, what parliamentary procedure is, it's the set of rules and procedures that control all of debate. It's very formal in manner and it's extremely organized according to something called a motion, or through other discussions and speeches. Now, all a motion is a proposal to do something or a proposal to go a certain direction in the conference to make something happen. Most motions will require a second, which means someone else raises their placard in support of the motion, and a majority vote, which of course a majority is established at the beginning of the conference. And there's an endnote in there that says refer to the short form of the rules. And I just want to point this out, all of you should of course already have this in your binder, but it is like your cheat sheet for the entire year and therefore should maybe even be in front of your binder. It is basically a summary of what starts out as the long form of the rules, which is like a 10-page or even longer summary of everything that goes on in Model UN, except this one's your best friend. It starts out, as we just mentioned, all of these are motions. Everything you see here is something that you can move for during the conference. And so we're actually going to get into what some of these are in a minute here. But just keep in mind that right in this column it says if the motion requires a second, then it says debatable. And what that means is if the motion requires two people to speak for it, two people to speak against it, or rather gives the chance for them to do that. If not, it goes straight from is there a second into voting procedure, just to make that clear. So now actually going to get into what some of these motions are. First keep in mind that all motions are preceded by are there any motions at this time, and then if there are none, discussion is preceded by is there any discussion or are there any speakers wishing to take the floor. Motions will always have precedence over discussion, meaning before we go into discussion, the chair will always say are there any motions at this time. Make sure when making a motion that you say, I move that, or the country of blank moves that, not I motion that, because motion is a noun and we cannot do nouns. Also, before we actually get into motions, make sure that in Model United Nations you are always speaking in the third person. Your goal is to represent your country during the MUN conference, or rather a group greater than yourself. So examples when representing a country would be the delegate from blank country believes, or the Republic of blank finds that. Do not say you are the Republic of something if your country is not a republic. And examples kind of as a single person say, this individual has the opinion that, this delegate believes, the delegate believes, anything like that, which will mainly be used when replying to perhaps points of inquiry, which I'll get to right now. There are 3 points that are used during the Model United Nations Conference. The first is a point of information, not to be confused with the point of inquiry. A point of information is when a delegate raises their placard and says, point of information. This immediately takes precedence over everything else, debate is halted, and the chair will say, on information, blank country. That means that the delegate that called the point of information has the permission to ask about anything they want. A question of information can be a complete digression from the topic at hand, and is used to ask maybe about rules or procedures that they're not familiar with. For example, if the Republic of Botswana raised their placard and said point of information, the chair would say on information Botswana. Botswana would say, is this a good time to move for an unmoderated caucus? And the chair would say either yes, this would be an appropriate time for that, or no, you will have to wait later, or no, we're in voting procedure, that's not even a motion at this time. Okay, so it's to understand the conference better, it's not actually related to debate. Then getting into that, we have the point of inquiry. This one is actually related to debate, and many delegates at the conference confuse this with point of information, which can get fairly annoying. So do not be that person that gets point of inquiry confused with point of information. This is used only to question another delegate when appropriate, and this is a method of debate used to either hurt or help them. When a delegate comes up, gives a speech, and is finished with their speech, the chair will ask, is the delegate accepting points of inquiry at this time? Anyone from MVHS Model UN will always say yes, and I'm going to say why in a second. However, at that time, other delegates will say, raise their placard, say point of inquiry. The chair will call on the countries of their choice, and that country will question the speaker who just spoke in the form of a question, of course. all speaking is directed through the chair. So a speaker just came up, talked about nuclear power, sat down, they are accepting points of inquiry. Another delegate raises their placard and said, point of inquiry, are you aware that nuclear power is extremely dangerous? To which the delegate replied, yes, I understand it's dangerous, but its benefits outweigh the costs, and so on. Okay, there is no more discussion after that. It only goes question and answer. Okay? All questions, like I said, are directed through the chair. You will never say, are you aware? You will say, is the delegate from blank aware that? The reason you always want to accept points of inquiry. Imagine a delegate that gets up and gives this long speech that has clearly been prepared, which isn't a bad thing, but then says, no, I don't really want to answer questions. Now, that would obviously come off as, I don't really know what I'm talking about because I'm not prepared to answer people's questions. To me, I can't elaborate on what I'm saying, and that shows a complete lack of research. Now, of course, by answering points of inquiry, you're opening yourself up to potential enemies trying to expose a hole in your argument, and oftentimes that's entirely okay. They will try to throw something completely irrelevant at you that might not even make sense to your argument or that you don't even have to know, in which case you can say one of two things. You can say, I do not believe that's relevant to my argument, or you can say, I will get back to you in writing. And whether you actually get back to them in writing is up to you. Because during the conference, you are allowed to pass notes, you're allowed to use laptops, you're allowed to whisper, and then, of course, when everyone's up and talking, you're allowed to go over to them. That is up to you. You don't necessarily have to. That's a great way to avoid the question. And then we get to our final point, which is the point of order. This is only used in very rare conditions when a delegate believes that the rules are not being followed. In a less hostile sense, it can be used against the chair, for example, if the chair is not following their own rules, which is something that actually does happen quite often. For example, say we do a majority vote when it's supposed to be a 2/3 vote. A delegate would say, point of order, that was supposed to be a 2/3 vote. If the delegate's correct, successful point of order, we go back and it is a majority vote. If it's used against another delegate, you are saying that that delegate did something wrong and the chair missed it. And that is actually an extremely hostile accusation. Delegates can get fairly mad at each other when they accuse each other of points of order, especially if it's not a valid point of order. So keep that in mind if you're going to do a point of order, unless you're positive something is wrong. The next part of the conference is setting limits, and of course this is a motion, and it's done at the beginning of every debate. It sets basically the conditions for the rest of the conference. It sets limits on speaking time for speeches, which cannot be lower than 3 minutes at Arizona Model UN. And it sets limits on the number of points of inquiry, which is the number of questions that can be allowed to the speaker. For example, the delegate moves to set limits on debate to 4 minutes for speeches with 5 points of inquiry. At this time, the motion is debatable, meaning 2 people can speak for it and 2 against, and this is a motion that can be done at any point in the conference. What would happen in this case would, for example, the Republic of Botswana moves to set limits on debate to 4 minutes for speeches with 5 points of inquiry. Is there a second? If people raise their placards and second it, we would go into debate, 2 speakers for, 2 against. Those individuals would rise, state their claims, say why they are for or against, and then we would go into a simple majority vote. If this motion does pass, the limits on debate are set, and it would be 4 minutes for speeches, 5 points of inquiry, meaning that per speech, 5 points of inquiry can be asked, and no speaker can speak longer than 4 minutes. Okay, and this can be done once again at any point if you feel for some reason if there's too much speaking time, too many points of inquiry, things are going too slow, you can shorten them, or if things are too short, going too fast, not enough clarification or detail, you can extend those. Okay, so that is one motion, and if you refer once again to your short form of the rules, all of this information is reiterated right there. You can see limits on debate right on this line. Under second, yes, 2 pro, 2 con, it is a majority vote, and then there's a short description. Place limits on debate of speaking time, time allotted to point of inquiry, or number of points of inquiry. Okay? The next thing that you would do at the beginning of a conference is set the order of agenda. And now, at the conferences we go to, the topics are already assigned. And so the order of agenda is the order in which these topics will be discussed. This can also be changed at any point during debate. If you look back at your short form of the rules, just check out changing the order of agenda items. This does require a second, but it is not debatable, meaning that delegates cannot say if they're for or against or why, and it does still require a majority vote, and it changes the order in which topics are discussed. For example, the way this would be achieved was the delegate moves to change the order of agenda from nuclear power, then human cloning, to human cloning, and then nuclear power. What this essentially does is changes the topics around, flips the order, and will entirely rearrange the topic being discussed or the topic that's about to be discussed. It's often used to change the subject, and if there is no agreement on a present subject, this is a strategy to give others more time to think before returning later, resuming, and oftentimes during a stalemate when nothing's being accomplished, you'll see the order of agenda changed. Most importantly, it happens at the beginning of the conference before an order has even been established. If your country has no interest in the first topic, but really wants to talk about the second, it may be in your best interest to try to change the order of agenda so that the second comes first. You can get your resolutions and everything down so that you don't run out of time. Because I will say that most often the last subject or the last topic being discussed will not be reached in its entirety. After that, just to go over voting real quick, as you can see, we've been discussing majority votes. And everything in Model United Nations must be voted on, and a majority vote is anything over 50% of the delegates, obviously. A two-thirds majority is always established before the conference begins and is occasionally used in voting. Now, in voting for anything in Model United Nations, there are 4 types of voting. When we go into voting procedure, the chair will say, "We are now in voting procedure. Are there any motions at this time?" This means that you may make a motion related to voting procedure, and you may make one of 3 motions. The first is adoption by consensus. This means that you believe nobody is going to object to the motion. Everybody will agree. And if someone motions for moves for adoption by consensus, the chair will simply say, "Are there any objections?" If there aren't, it is adopted by consensus. If there are, we go back to voting procedure. The roll call vote is usually used to completely stall for time, delay the conference, or sometimes even find out who is voting for what in certain cases. What happens is you motion for a roll call vote. This automatically happens. The chair will call on each individual country and ask for their vote. Yes, no. Or there is abstain, which means you have no opinion, or abstain from the order. And that means the chair will come back to you at the very end, and this is usually used to see how other countries vote. Say you're a minor country in support of a major country like the United States. You want to vote with the U.S., but you come before the U.S. You would abstain from the order. The U.S. would say their vote. Then they would go back to you at the end of voting, and you would side with whatever the U.S. chose. And that's mainly the purpose of roll call vote and how that works. But once again, it takes a very long period of time. And then there's division of the question, which is only really used during the resolution process, which we can get into later. But basically what that does is it breaks apart what you're voting for, and you vote on each individual element of the motion or the resolution. Okay? And then you can eliminate certain parts or put certain parts into practice. An introduction to actual speaking. After all these conditions are set, you can actually move into debate. And this would start with, after there are no motions, are there any speakers wishing to take the floor at this time? Going first will always have its perks. You form debate, you get your opinion out, and you shape the rest of the discussion in its entirety. For example, not all countries will be interested in talking about the same thing regarding a certain subject. For example, if you're on nuclear power, and one country wants to talk about nuclear weapons, the other wants to talk about nuclear energy, whichever one gives a speech first sets the course for the entire debate. So never wait too long, or you may entirely miss your chance to get your opinion out. Always try to go first as possible, because then everyone's going to be talking about your issue. As the year progresses, we'll go more into debate and more into speaking. Just make sure you talk clearly and you project. If you took notes over wherever you were, it's okay to use them. Just don't stare straight at them. Speeches can be as long as you want, as long as they're below the maximum time, but there is no minimum time. And so you can do like a 10-second speech. At the end of your speech, we may decide whether you want points of inquiry or not. Once again, you do want points of inquiry if you want to have a solid argument. Saying no suggests that you are not confident in your opinion, and the goal is to be prepared for anything, hence research time. This is everything you really need to know about parliamentary procedure. If you actually want to practice this, it's a good idea to go to the Wednesday conferences, to the II workshops, or even to any of the other events that are happening in MVHS Model UN, as we will go over these practices and over these conferences. All that you need to remember is you start by setting the limits, then you go to the order of agenda, and then we break right into speaking. And that's the most important, of course, part of the conference is debate, except for when we get into resolutions, but of course resolutions are always stemmed from debate. So I hope this helped everyone, maybe get a grasp of how things are organized and how things are ordered and what you can do in the Model UN conference. As we progress, you'll kind of start to understand how this whole system works, and I hope that we can get there soon so everyone's on the same page. Once again, try to attend as many workshops as possible, and you will definitely understand everything that was said here. Thank you for watching.